Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. The story of Mice and Men begins in the vast countryside of California's Salinas Valley, a setting that seems peaceful and untouched. The golden fields stretch for miles, the leaves rustle in the soft breeze, and the Salinas River winds its way through the land, reflecting the late afternoon sun. Rabbits dart between the bushes, and birds flit through the sycamore trees that line the banks. On the surface, it is a place of quiet beauty, but the silence hides the struggle of the men who pass through this valley, searching for work, seeking something better. It is in this landscape that we meet George Milton and Lennie Small, two migrant workers walking along a dusty path that leads to a ranch where they hope to find employment. Their clothes are the same as those of every other ranch hand: denim trousers, black coats, and wide-brimmed hats worn down from travel and sun. George, a small but wiry man with sharp features, walks with a sense of purpose. His dark eyes are watchful, constantly scanning the path ahead, as if expecting trouble. Lennie, by contrast, is an enormous man, broad-shouldered and powerful, but his movements are slow and uncoordinated, his face innocent and uncomprehending. He follows George like a shadow, mirroring his steps without question, his large hands hanging loosely at his sides. As they walk, Lennie grows excited when he spots a small pond and rushes forward, dropping to his knees to gulp the water in large, greedy swallows. George, irritated, pulls him back, warning him not to drink too much or too fast. He doesn't want Lennie getting sick again, like he did the last time they found a pond. This moment establishes the relationship between them, George as the caretaker, always watching out for Lennie, while Lennie, simple-minded and childlike, relies entirely on George to guide him. Lennie, though a grown man, has the mind of a child. He has a fascination with soft things and reaches into his pocket to retrieve a small, lifeless mouse, its fur flattened from being stroked too much. He tries to keep it hidden, but George, already suspecting something, demands to see what Lennie is holding. When he sees the dead mouse, George scolds him and throws it away, knowing that Lennie likely killed it by petting it too hard. Lennie, upset, insists that he didn't mean to hurt it, that he just wanted to feel its soft fur. This small exchange foreshadows one of the novel's central themes, Lennie's strength, combined with his lack of understanding, makes him dangerous, even when he means no harm. As they sit by the pond, preparing to eat, Lennie asks George to tell him about their dream. This is a story they have repeated many times before, but Lennie never tires of hearing it. With enthusiasm, George begins to recite their shared vision, a small piece of land they will own one day, with a cozy house and a vegetable garden. They won't have to work for other people anymore. They won't be at the mercy of cruel bosses or harsh conditions. Most of all, Lennie will get to tend the rabbits, taking care of them, petting their soft fur as much as he likes. Lennie claps his hands in excitement, repeating over and over, "And I get to tend the rabbits." For him, this dream is more than just an escape. It is a source of joy, something to hold on to when life is difficult. George, too, is drawn into the fantasy, though deep down, he knows how unlikely it is. Still, telling the story brings him comfort. Unlike the countless other men wandering the countryside, he and Lennie have each other. They are not alone, but reality soon sets in. As they eat their meager supper of canned beans, Lennie innocently suggests that he would like some ketchup to go with them. This small request sets off George's frustration. He erupts into a rant about how much easier his life would be without Lennie, how he could have a steady job, spend his money as he pleased, maybe even enjoy a little freedom. God Almighty, if I was alone, I could live so easy, he snaps. Lennie, hurt by the outburst, offers to leave George and live in a cave by himself. Immediately, George softens. He knows he doesn't mean what he said. Life without Lennie might be easier, but it would also be lonelier. He sighs, placing a reassuring hand on Lennie's shoulder, and tells him once again about their dream, about how one day they'll have their own place and no one will ever be able to tell them what to do. Lennie, comforted, leans back and listens, holding onto the dream with all his heart. Before they settle in for the night, George gives Lennie an important instruction. If anything bad happens at the ranch, Lennie must remember this exact spot by the river and hide there until George comes for him. The warning carries an ominous weight. Even though they haven't arrived at the ranch yet, George already suspects that trouble may follow them. As dawn breaks, the two men rise and dust themselves off, preparing for the day ahead. They know that the ranch they are heading to will be like every other, a place where men toil under the hot sun, breaking their backs for little pay and no real future. But they cling to the hope that this time will be different, that maybe, just maybe, their dream is within reach. As they set off down the path once more, the quiet rustling of the trees and the gentle murmur of the river seem to whisper of both possibility and doom. George and Lennie walk side by side, bound together by friendship, by need, and by a dream that may be too fragile to survive in the harsh world they live in. The morning light casts long shadows as George and Lennie make their way toward the ranch. Dust rises around their feet, the scent of earth and sweat already thick in the air. The ranch comes into view, rows of wooden bunkhouses, the sprawling barn, and the endless fields stretching beyond. It is the kind of place that swallows men whole, grinding them down with back-breaking labor before spitting them out with little to show for it. But for George and Lennie, this ranch represents hope, a chance to earn enough money to finally buy their own land. As they approach, George reminds Lennie once again to stay quiet and let him do the talking. He knows that Lennie's innocent nature and lack of understanding could get them in trouble before they even start. Lennie nods obediently, determined to follow George's instructions. He trusts George completely, even when he doesn't fully understand the reason behind his words. Inside the main bunkhouse, they are met by an older man with a missing hand, Candy, the swamper. Candy is friendly enough, though there is a sadness in his demeanor, a tiredness that speaks of years spent in the same cycle of work and disappointment. He shows them to their bunks, simple wooden frames with straw-filled mattresses, and gives them a brief rundown of the place. The boss, he tells them, is already upset that they arrived late. George immediately senses trouble, but he remains calm, preparing himself to smooth things over. A moment later, the boss arrives, a stocky man with a stern expression. He eyes George and Lennie suspiciously, demanding to know why they didn't show up the night before. George, always quick on his feet, explains that they had trouble finding the ranch, a half-truth meant to ease the tension. The boss isn't entirely convinced, but he lets it slide. However, his suspicion deepens when he notices that Lennie doesn't speak for himself. "What's wrong with him?" the boss asks, narrowing his eyes at Lennie. George quickly interjects, saying that Lennie isn't much of a talker but is strong as an ox, a good worker who will put in his share and then some. The boss seems unconvinced but ultimately relents, assigning them to work on the barley fields under a man named Slim. As he leaves, George exhales in relief. Lennie, unaware of the close call, grins excitedly. "We got the job, George," he exclaims. But the moment of relief is short-lived. Soon, another figure enters the bunkhouse, a young man with a mean glint in his eye. Curly, the boss's son, is small but carries himself like he's the toughest man on the ranch. His hands are curled into tight fists, and there is an arrogance in the way he moves, like he's always spoiling for a fight. Curly's gaze lands on Lennie, and immediately, something about Lennie's size and quiet demeanor rubs him the wrong way. Curly doesn't like big men. It makes him feel small, weak. He steps closer, his body tensed like a coiled spring. "You talk, big guy," he demands. Lennie glances nervously at George, remembering his promise to stay quiet. George quickly answers for him, trying to defuse the situation, but Curly isn't satisfied. He glares at Lennie, his fists tightening. "Watch yourself," he mutters before storming out. George sighs, running a hand through his hair. "That guy's trouble," he mutters under his breath. He turns to Lennie, his voice firm. "Stay away from him, you hear me? If he picks a fight, you don't fight back." Lennie nods, but there is confusion in his eyes. He doesn't understand why Curly is angry, why he seems to hate him for no reason. But he trusts George, and that's enough. Soon, another man enters the bunkhouse, and the atmosphere shifts. This is Slim, the respected skinner of the ranch. He moves with quiet confidence, his presence commanding without being overbearing. Unlike Curly, Slim doesn't need to prove his strength. Everyone already respects him. He greets George and Lennie with a nod, his tone calm and even. "You guys travel together?" he asks, noting the unusual bond between them. Most men on ranches are loners, drifting from place to place with no attachments. George hesitates for a moment before answering. "Yeah, we look out for each other." Slim studies them for a moment before nodding approvingly. "Ain't many guys that do that. It's a good thing." For the first time since arriving at the ranch, George feels a small sense of ease. Slim isn't like the others. He isn't suspicious or cruel. There's something different about him, something that makes George believe they might actually be safe here, at least for a while. As the day ends, George and Lennie settle into their bunks, exhaustion settling over them. The ranch is filled with dangers, Curly, the harsh work, the ever-present threat of failure. But for now, they have a job, and that is enough to keep their dream alive for one more day. The sun is already high in the sky when George and Lennie begin their first real day of work on the ranch. The barley fields stretch wide, golden under the sunlight, the scent of dry earth and sweat filling the air. The ranch hands move with practiced efficiency, their bodies bending and lifting in a rhythm that comes from years of hard labor. George and Lennie join them, each taking their place under Slim's watchful eye. Lennie, as expected, proves to be incredibly strong. His hands move quickly, easily lifting the heavy bags of barley that other men struggle with. He works with a childlike eagerness, pleased by the approving nods he gets from Slim. George watches him carefully, always mindful of potential trouble, but for now, everything seems to be going well. During their short water break, Slim approaches George, wiping sweat from his brow. "That Lennie, he's sure a strong fella," he says, almost in admiration. "Ain't seen a man lift like that in a while." George nods, but there's a hint of weariness in his expression. "Yeah, he don't know his own strength though, that's the problem." Slim studies George for a moment before saying, "You two been together long?" George hesitates, then nods. "Since we were kids." He doesn't usually talk about it, but something about Slim makes him open up. His Aunt Clara took care of him, but when she passed, he stuck with me. I guess I've been looking after him ever since. Slim listens, his face thoughtful. Not many men do that. Most guys on the road don't have nobody. George sighs, kicking at the dirt. Yeah, well, sometimes I think how much easier it'd be without him. He gets us into trouble and I gotta get us out. But I couldn't leave him. He'd never make it on his own. Slim nods, understanding. There's no judgment in his eyes, only quiet respect. As the men return to work, a small commotion stirs in the barn. Carlson, one of the ranch hands, has cornered Candy, the old swamper, and is gesturing toward the old dog lying at Candy's feet. The dog, once a strong and capable sheep herder, is now little more than a shadow of its former self, blind, slow-moving, and barely able to eat. Carlson wrinkles his nose. "That dog stinks something awful," he complains. "Ain't no good to nobody no more. You oughta put him out of his misery." Candy flinches, his weathered hands tightening into fists. The dog is more than just an animal to him. It's his last connection to a past where he was still useful, still strong. Candy looks around the room, his gaze searching for support, but none of the other men speak up. He turns to Slim, almost pleading. "I've been with him since he was a pup," he says softly. "I don't mind the smell. He don't do no harm." Slim, though kind, is practical. "It ain't good to let a dog suffer," he says gently. "It'd be better for him." Candy's shoulders sag. He knows they're right. But the thought of losing his only companion, the one thing that's been with him through all these lonely years, is almost too much to bear. Carlson doesn't wait for more argument. He stands, reaching for his gun. "I'll do it," he says, and Candy's breath catches in his throat. He looks away as Carlson leads the dog outside. The room falls silent, the air thick with tension. A long, agonizing moment passes. Then, from outside, a single gunshot rings through the night. Candy stares at the floor, his lips pressed into a thin line. He doesn't speak, but something in him seems to break. George shifts uncomfortably, while Lennie, not fully understanding, only looks at the door in confusion. To break the heavy silence, George suddenly speaks. "You know, me and Lennie got a plan," he says, forcing a smile. "A little place of our own, a couple acres, gonna have rabbits and chickens, and we won't have to work for no one but ourselves." Lennie lights up instantly, nodding enthusiastically. "Tell him, George. Tell him about the rabbits." George grins, launching into the familiar tale of their dream, a small farm, a simple life, freedom from the endless cycle of hard labor and uncertainty. The other men listen, half amused at first, but something about George's voice, the certainty in it, draws them in. Then, unexpectedly, Candy speaks up. His voice is quiet, almost hesitant. "I got money," he says. "Saved up from all these years. If you'd let me, I'd go in on it with you." George blinks in surprise. He hadn't expected this. "You serious?" Candy nods. "Ain't got no family, ain't got nothing to spend it on. If you let me, I'll help buy the land and I'll work too." For a moment, George is stunned. Could this really happen? Could their dream, something he'd always considered just out of reach, actually become real? For the first time, it seems possible. As the conversation continues, Curly storms into the bunkhouse, his expression dark. His hands are clenched into fists, and there's a barely controlled rage in his posture. "Any of you seen my wife?" he snaps. The men exchange glances. No one answers. Curly's wife, young and restless, has been seen wandering around the ranch, talking to the men despite her husband's warnings. She's beautiful, with bright red lips and soft curls. But there's something desperate in her eyes, something lonely. Curly's gaze lands on Lennie. He sees the big man's confused expression, the way he stiffens under his scrutiny, and instantly, Curly's temper flares. Without warning, he steps forward and throws a punch. Lennie stumbles back, raising his arms in confusion. I didn't do nothing, George, he whimpers, looking to his friend for help. George jumps to his feet. Leave him alone, Curly. But Curly doesn't stop. He sees an easy target in Lennie, someone who won't fight back. He lands another blow, hitting Lennie square in the face. Blood trickles from Lennie's nose, his large hands still raised in helplessness. Then George shouts, "Get him, Lennie." Lennie hesitates, but George's command breaks through his fear. Instinctively, his massive hands reach out, catching Curly's fist in midair. The smaller man's eyes widen in shock as Lennie grips his hand, then squeezes. A sickening crunch echoes through the room. Curly lets out a strangled cry, his face contorting in pain as Lennie crushes his hand with terrifying strength. The other men leap forward, pulling Lennie off him, but the damage is done. Curly falls to the floor, cradling his broken hand, his face pale. Slim steps forward, his voice calm but firm. "You tell anyone what happened," he says, "and we'll tell him you got your hand caught in a machine. You hear me?" Curly nods weakly. He has no choice. As the men slowly disperse, Lennie looks at George with wide, terrified eyes. "I didn't mean to, George," he whispers. "I didn't want to hurt nobody." George sighs, running a hand through his hair. "I know, Lennie, I know." But in his heart, he feels a familiar fear creeping in. Trouble always seems to follow them, and this time, he isn't sure they'll be able to outrun it. The next evening, the barn is quiet except for the sound of a horse shifting in its stall. The other ranch hands are gathered in the bunkhouse, talking and playing cards. But Crooks, the stable buck, sits alone in his small, dimly lit room attached to the barn. His quarters are separate from the others. Because he's black, he isn't allowed to sleep in the bunkhouse. His room is small, filled with a few books and personal belongings, but it is a lonely space, a place of isolation. He sits on his cot, rubbing liniment into his aching back, when the door creaks open. Lennie steps inside, his large frame almost filling the doorway. He isn't supposed to be there, but he had seen Crook's light on and, curious as always, wandered in. Crooks looks up, startled, then scowls. "You ain't supposed to be in here," he mutters. Lennie frowns, confused. "Why not?" Crooks hesitates before answering, his voice bitter. "'Cause I'm black. They don't let me in the bunkhouse. You ain't got no right common in my room either." Lennie shifts uncomfortably, but he doesn't leave. "I just seen your light," he says simply. "I didn't mean no harm." For a moment, Crooks considers sending Lennie away, but the big man's face is open and innocent, lacking the malice Crooks has come to expect from the others. With a sigh, he shrugs. "Ah, hell, come on in if you want." Lennie steps inside, looking curiously around the small room. His eyes land on the books stacked on a shelf. "You got books," he says in wonder. "George ain't got books." Crooks lets out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, I read a lot. A guy gets awful lonely when he's got nobody to talk to." The word lonely catches Lennie's attention. "I don't get lonely," he says. "I got George." Crooks studies him, then smirks. "Yeah, but what if George didn't come back? What if he left you all alone? What would you do then?" Lennie's face immediately changes. His expression tightens, and he looks suddenly frightened. "George wouldn't leave me," he says quickly. "He wouldn't." But Crooks presses on, enjoying the small bit of power he has in this conversation. "What if he did, though? What if one day he just don't come back? Maybe he gets hurt. Maybe he decides he don't want you no more. Lennie's breathing quickens and his hands twitch. He won't, he insists, his voice rising in panic. George is gonna come back. Seeing Lennie's distress, Crooks immediately regrets his words. He softens slightly. I was just messing with you, he says. I didn't mean nothing by it. Lennie stares at him for a long moment, still shaken, before finally relaxing. Me and George, we got a place, he says, almost to himself. A little farm with rabbits. Crooks raises an eyebrow. A farm, huh? He shakes his head. I've heard guys talk like that before. Ain't never seen one make it happen. Before Lennie can argue, another voice cuts into the conversation. You talking about that place again? Candy steps into the room, his old face eager. He had overheard Lennie talking about the dream, and ever since their conversation in the bunkhouse, he has clung to the idea as desperately as Lennie does. Crooks watches them both, and for a brief moment, something flickers in his eyes, hope. You know, he says slowly, I've worked on a lot of ranches, seen a lot of men come and go. If you guys are serious, maybe I could help out. I ain't much good for labor with my back, but I can do things. Fix stuff. Work the garden. Candy brightens. Yeah, we could use the help. More hands make it easier. For a moment, the dream feels real. A quiet little farm, a place of their own where they wouldn't have to answer to anyone. But just as quickly, reality intrudes. A shadow falls over the doorway, and a woman's voice interrupts them. What's going on in here? Curly's wife stands in the entrance, her lips painted a deep red, her blonde curls framing her face. She looks at the men with something between amusement and disdain. All the weak ones in one place, huh? She sneers. Crook's expression hardens. You got no right being here. Curly's wife ignores him. A bunch of bindle stiffs sitting around talking about how they're gonna get their own place. She laughs, but there's bitterness in it. You think you're gonna get out of here? You think you'll ever have a place of your own? She shakes her head. I seen too many guys like you. Ain't never gonna happen. Candy stiffens. We'll show you. We got money saved up. But Curly's wife isn't interested in their dream. She steps further into the room, her eyes locking onto Crooks. You're the lowest one here, she says coldly. I could have you strung up on a tree so fast it'd make your head spin. Crooks' face darkens, and he looks away. He knows she's right. In this world, his word means nothing against hers. Satisfied, Curly's wife turns away. Ain't nobody gonna get nowhere, she mutters before sauntering out. The room falls into heavy silence. The dream, which had felt so tangible just moments ago, now seems impossibly distant. After a long pause, Crooks sighs and stands. I was just kidding, he mutters. I don't want nothing to do with your farm. Candy stares at him. You were serious a minute ago. Crooks shakes his head. Forget it. It ain't gonna happen. Lennie looks at George, confused. We are gonna get it, right, George? George nods, but his voice lacks conviction. Yeah, sure, Lennie. As the night stretches on, the men sit in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The weight of reality presses down on them. Dreams are fragile things, and in a world as unforgiving as theirs, they rarely survive. The afternoon sun filters through the open barn doors, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. Outside, the men are enjoying their Sunday, playing horseshoes and talking loudly. Inside the barn, however, it is quiet, except for the soft rustling of hay and the occasional snort from a horse in its stall. Lennie is there alone, sitting in the straw, cradling his puppy in his massive hands. He looks down at it, his thick fingers stroking its soft fur, but his expression is troubled. The puppy lies still, unmoving. He had been playing with it, but as always, Lennie doesn't know his own strength. He had accidentally hit it too hard when it nipped at him, and now it won't wake up. His lower lip trembles. "Why'd you gotta go and die?" he whispers. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Lennie strokes the puppy's ears, trying to convince himself it isn't really dead, but deep down he knows. His panic begins to rise. What will George say? Will he be mad? Will he still let Lennie tend the rabbits? "No, no, no," he mutters, his voice growing more desperate. "George can't find out." Lennie covers the puppy with straw, as if hiding it will make the problem disappear. He rocks back and forth, his mind racing when suddenly, the sound of footsteps on the barn floor makes him freeze. Curly's wife steps into the barn, her red dress catching the sunlight. She looks around, then spots Lennie. Her expression is curious, not unkind. "What are you doing in here all by yourself?" she asks, stepping closer. Lennie shrinks back, looking at the barn doors. "I ain't supposed to talk to you," he says quickly. Curly's wife rolls her eyes. "Ain't nobody gonna see us." She sighs and leans against a wooden post. "Besides, what's the harm? Ain't like I got anyone else to talk to." Lennie shifts uncomfortably, his mind still stuck on his dead puppy. "I done a bad thing," he mumbles. "George is gonna be mad." Curly's wife raises an eyebrow. "What you do?" Lennie hesitates, then uncovers the puppy. "I didn't mean to kill it," he says. "It was just so little, and I was playing with it, and then..." His face twists with confusion and guilt. "I didn't mean to." Curly's wife watches him for a moment, then shrugs. "That ain't so bad. Lots of guys hurt things without meaning to." Her voice softens. "I know how it feels, wanting something so bad but always messing it up." Lennie looks at her, his eyes wide and childlike. "Yeah." She sighs and sits down in the hay beside him. "I could have been in the movies, you know. Had a guy in Hollywood tell me I had what it takes. But then I married Curly, and now look at me. Stuck on a ranch, talking to a bunch of guys who don't care about nothing but work." Lennie doesn't really understand, but he hears the sadness in her voice. "George says we're gonna have a farm," he says suddenly. "With rabbits," Curly's wife smiles. "Rabbits, huh?" Lennie nods eagerly. "I get to tend 'em, soft like my puppy was," he frowns. "I like soft things." Curly's wife tilts her head. "I got soft hair," she says, lifting her blonde curls. "Feel how soft it is." Lennie hesitates, then reaches out, his big fingers stroking her hair gently. He smiles. "It is soft," he says, pleased. Encouraged, Curly's wife laughs. "See, it ain't no harm." But Lennie keeps stroking, his touch getting heavier. Curly's wife shifts, suddenly uncomfortable. "Hey, not so hard," she says. Lennie doesn't stop. He's mesmerized, caught up in the texture, just like he had been with the puppy. "I said stop," she exclaims, trying to pull away. Lennie's grip tightens. "No, don't go," he pleads, panic rising in his voice. She struggles, twisting in his grasp. "Let go, you're hurting me," Lennie's fear explodes. "Don't yell, you'll get me in trouble." His hands clamp over her mouth to keep her quiet. He doesn't mean to hurt her, just like he hadn't meant to hurt the puppy. But she keeps struggling, and Lennie doesn't understand his own strength. Suddenly, she stops moving. Her body goes limp in his arms. Lennie stares at her, his hands still gripping her hair. "I didn't mean to," he whispers, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean, but it's too late. Curly's wife is dead." Lennie lets go, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stares at her unmoving body, his mind racing. He knows this is bad. He knows George will be mad. He knows he's done something terrible. His hands shake as he backs away, his gaze darting around the barn like a trapped animal. He He remembers George's instructions, the one thing he was told to do if anything went wrong. "The brush," he mutters. "Go to the brush." Without another thought, he turns and runs, slipping out of the barn and disappearing into the fading light. Back inside, the barn is silent once more. The horses shift in their stalls, the dust settles, and the body of Curly's wife lies still in the straw. The late afternoon sun drapes the ranch in a golden haze, but the peaceful illusion is shattered when Candy enters the barn. He had come looking for Lennie, expecting to find him tending to the puppy or daydreaming about their future farm. Instead, his eyes land on Curly's wife, her body sprawled in the hay, her face unnaturally still. For a moment, he doesn't move. The realization sinks into his bones like ice. He steps closer, his breathing shallow. He nudges her shoulder, but she doesn't stir. Her neck is twisted at an odd angle. Candy stumbles back, gripping the wall for support. His mind races. This is bad. This is real bad. There's only one person who could have done this. His first thought is to find George. He rushes out of the barn, his old legs moving faster than they have in years. He finds George in the bunkhouse, sitting on his bunk, lost in thought. When Candy bursts through the door, his face pale, George knows something is wrong before the words even leave his mouth. "It's Lennie," Candy gasps. "He done something bad, George, real bad." George doesn't ask what. He already knows. The weight of inevitability presses down on him. Candy grabs George's arm. "We gotta tell the others." George hesitates. He knows what's coming. He knows what Curly will do. There's no way out of this. No more dreams of the farm, no more rabbits, no more second chances. He nods slowly. "I know where he went." Candy stares at him. "Where?" George takes a deep breath. "By the river. The brush." He always remembers that. Candy looks at him, searching his face for some kind of hope, but there is none. You ain't gonna let them hurt him, are ya, George?" George doesn't answer. Instead, he straightens, his expression unreadable, and follows Candy out of the bunkhouse. By the time they reach the barn, the men have already gathered. Curly is there, his face dark with rage. Slim kneels beside his wife's body, touching her wrist, but it's clear she's gone. The moment Curly sees George, his fury erupts. "Where is he?" he demands. "Where's that son of a bitch?" George stays calm. "I dunno, Curly." Curly doesn't believe him. His hand tightens into a fist. "He's gonna pay for this." He turns to the other men. "Get your guns, boys. We're gonna hunt him down." Slim stands, his face heavy with sorrow. "He didn't mean it, Curly." Curly's eyes burn with rage. "I don't care. He's dead, you hear me." The men scatter, grabbing their rifles, their boots kicking up dust as they prepare for the manhunt. Carlson checks for his Luger, but it's missing. He swears under his breath. Curly glares at George. "You better not be protecting him." George shakes his head. "I ain't." But as the men charge out of the barn, George turns in the opposite direction, heading toward the river, toward the one place he knows Lennie will be. Lennie sits by the riverbank, curled up in the brush, just like George told him to do if anything bad ever happened. His body shakes with fear, his mind replaying George's words over and over. "Come here. Hide in the brush. Wait for me." He rocks back and forth, whispering to himself. George ain't gonna be mad. George is gonna fix it. But deep down, a terrible fear gnaws at him. Maybe this time George can't fix it. Maybe this time things won't go back to normal. And then the voices come. At first, they're just whispers in his head. His Aunt Clara appears, scowling at him, shaking her head. "I tall you, Lennie, I tall you, and what did you do?" You always mess things up. Then the rabbit comes. A gigantic, talking rabbit with an accusing voice. You ain't fit to tend no rabbits. You ain't worth nothin'. Lennie covers his ears, whimpering. George is gonna come, George'll take care of me. The voices fade, and suddenly, he hears footsteps. He turns, and there, stepping through the brush, is George. Lennie's face lights up with relief. George, I knew you'd come. George forces a smile. Sure, Lennie, I came. He steps closer, his hand inside his jacket, gripping the stolen Luger. Lennie doesn't notice the sadness in George's eyes. I done a bad thing, he admits, his voice small. But you ain't mad, are you, George? George shakes his head. No, Lennie, I ain't mad. Lennie smiles, reassured. I thought you was gonna give me hell. George forces himself to keep his voice steady. Nah, I want you to look across the river, Lennie. Think about that place we talked about. Lennie turns his eyes to the horizon, his mind filling with the dream. Tell me about the farm, George, he says eagerly. Tell me about the rabbits. George's voice trembles, but he keeps going. We gonna get a little place, he says, with a couple acres, a cow, some chickens. Lennie smiles, his shoulders relaxing. And rabbits. I get to tend the rabbits. George nods. Yeah, Lennie, you'll get to tend the rabbits. His hand tightens around the gun. His breathing is shallow. The voices of the men are getting closer. Lennie is still lost in the dream, his eyes shining. Tell me again, George. George swallows the lump in his throat. His voice is barely above a whisper. We gonna live off the fat of the land. And then he pulls the trigger. Lennie's body jerks, then goes still. The smile fades from his face. He crumples forward, peaceful, as if he had simply fallen asleep. George lowers the gun, his hand shaking. He stares down at Lennie, at his best friend, at the only person who ever truly believed in the dream. And the dream dies with him. The men burst through the brush, their rifles raised, but they stop when they see George standing over Lennie's body. Curly approaches, breathing heavily, his face still full of rage. Where'd you get that gun? Carlson asks. George doesn't answer. Slim steps forward, placing a hand on George's shoulder. He doesn't say much, but his eyes hold understanding. Come on, George, it's over. George nods slowly. He lets Slim lead him away, back toward the ranch, back toward the empty world that no longer holds the dream of a farm or rabbits, or the hope of a better life. And behind them, the river keeps flowing. The wind moves through the brush, and the sun begins to set on a dream that was never meant to be. John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men is one of the most widely read and studied books in American literature. Since its publication in 1937, it has become a staple in high school and college curricula, a touchstone for discussions on themes of friendship, loneliness, dreams, and the harsh realities of the American experience. Despite its relatively short length, the novel packs an emotional punch, exploring the struggles of displaced migrant workers during the Great Depression. Its lasting impact can be attributed to its raw depiction of human nature, its compelling narrative, and the complex moral dilemmas it presents. One of the reasons Of Mice and Men has remained relevant for so long is its accessibility. Unlike some classic novels that are difficult to understand due to archaic language or dense prose, Steinbeck's writing is straightforward, yet deeply evocative. The dialogue-driven storytelling makes it feel like a stage play, which was actually part of Steinbeck's original intention. He wrote the book in a way that it could be easily adapted for theatrical performances. And this direct, almost cinematic quality has made it particularly engaging for generations of readers. Furthermore, the novel's themes resonate across different eras and cultures. The struggle for economic stability, the pursuit of dreams, and the pain of loneliness are universal human experiences. Though the novel is set in the 1930s, its message still speaks to readers today, especially in times of economic hardship or social displacement. Readers see themselves in George and Lennie, in their hopes, their friendship, and their ultimate tragedy. In addition, Of Mice and Men is frequently assigned in schools, making it one of the most read and analyzed works of literature in the English-speaking world. Teachers and professors use it to discuss literary elements such as foreshadowing, symbolism, and character development. The novel also introduces students to key historical contexts, such as the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, providing an opportunity to examine how economic and social forces shape human lives. Steinbeck was known for his ability to blend realism with a deep sense of empathy for his characters, and Of Mice and Men exemplifies this talent. The novel is part of Steinbeck's broader body of work that explores themes of displacement, injustice, and the American dream. One of its most significant literary aspects is its use of foreshadowing. Nearly every major event in the novel is hinted at before it happens. Lennie's love of soft things, his accidental killing of the puppy, and George's instructions to hide in the brush all foreshadow the final, tragic scene. This technique gives the novel an air of inevitability, reinforcing the idea that Lennie and George's fate was sealed from the start. The novel's structure is also worth noting. Unlike many traditional narratives that are divided into chapters, Of Mice and Men unfolds in a series of 6 scenes, mirroring a play. Each section takes place in a single setting: the riverbank, the bunkhouse, the barn, almost as if they were different acts in a drama. This contributes to the novel's tightly woven plot and makes it feel more immediate and impactful. Steinbeck also uses strong imagery and symbolism throughout the book. The farm that George and Lennie dream about represents the illusion of the American dream, something always just out of reach, no matter how hard one works for it. The rabbits symbolize both hope and Lennie's innocence, and their unattainability highlights the novel's underlying message. For some, the American dream is nothing more than an illusion. Another significant element is Steinbeck's exploration of marginalized groups. The novel does not just tell the story of George and Lennie, but also highlights the struggles of other isolated characters. Crooks, an African-American stable hand ostracized due to his race. Candy, an old ranch worker who fears his usefulness is coming to an end. And Curly's wife, a lonely woman who is trapped in a life she never wanted. Through these characters, Steinbeck paints a picture of a society where loneliness and powerlessness are pervasive. Despite its widespread acclaim, Of Mice and Men has also faced significant controversy. Since its publication, it has frequently been challenged and even banned in schools due to its language, themes, and portrayal of violence. One of the main reasons it has been challenged is its use of racial slurs and offensive language. The novel reflects the realities of its time, where racism was deeply ingrained in society. Some argue that including such language, even in a historical context, is inappropriate for students. However, Many educators and literary scholars defend the book, arguing that it provides an opportunity to discuss racism openly and critically rather than ignoring its existence. Another major criticism of the book is its depiction of women. Curly's wife is the only significant female character, and she is often dismissed as flirtatious or manipulative. Some readers feel that she is a one-dimensional character who serves only as a plot device rather than a fully realized person. However, others argue that Steinbeck portrays her with sympathy, showing how she is trapped in a world where she has no real agency. Her loneliness and desperation for attention reflect the limited roles available to women during the 1930s, making her a tragic figure rather than a villain. The novel's depiction of intellectual disability has also sparked debate. Some argue that Lennie's characterization is overly simplistic, and that the novel reinforces negative stereotypes about people with mental disabilities. However, Steinbeck presents Lennie with deep compassion, emphasizing his innocence rather than portraying him as dangerous. His actions are not malicious, but rather the tragic result of a world that does not understand or accommodate people like him. Despite these controversies, Of Mice and Men remains one of the most frequently taught and studied books in schools. Many educators argue that rather than banning the book, it should be used as a tool for discussion, helping students engage with complex issues such as racism, ableism, gender roles, and economic struggle. Beyond literature, Of Mice and Men has left a lasting impact on popular culture. The novel has been adapted into several films, stage productions, and even radio dramas. The 1939 film, starring Burgess Meredith as George and Lon Chaney Jr. as Lennie, was well received, while the 1992 adaptation starring Gary Sinise and John Malkovich brought the story to a new generation of viewers. The book's themes and characters have also influenced countless other works of fiction. The idea of two misfit characters traveling together, bound by friendship and an impossible dream, has been echoed in films, television, and literature. Even outside of direct adaptations, the novel's themes continue to inspire stories about the pursuit of dreams and the brutal realities of life. Additionally, phrases from the book, such as the best laid plans of mice and men, originally from Robert Burns' poem, which inspired the title, and live off the fat of the land, have entered common speech, showing just how deeply the novel has embedded itself in cultural consciousness. So why does Of Mice and Men continue to resonate nearly a century after its publication? At its core, the novel speaks to the universal human experience, our need for companionship, our longing for security, and the harsh realities that often stand in the way of our dreams. It's a story of friendship and tragedy, of hope and loss, of the American dream and its unattainability for many. In a world where loneliness, economic hardship, and social division still exist, Of Mice and Men remains as relevant as ever. It forces us to confront difficult truths about society, and it challenges us to think about how we treat those who are vulnerable. Whether loved or criticized, Of Mice and Men is undeniably a significant work of literature, one that continues to be read, discussed, and debated by generations of readers. It is a testament to Steinbeck's ability to capture the human experience in its most raw and honest form, ensuring that George and Lennie's story will never be forgotten.